My wife Laura started staying at work more often. "A new project," she said, "we're working late into the night." I believed her. Why not? But one day, while looking for her keys, I found a hotel receipt. The date? The night she worked late. I put the receipt back and didn't say a word. The next week she was late again. "Don't wait for me," Laura said, kissing me on the cheek and leaving the house. I waited for an hour. Then I went to the same hotel. At the reception, I calmly asked the receptionist to dial the number. "Your husband is here. Should I invite him in or give him a message?" There was a pause. A minute later Laura came downstairs. Her hair was a little tousled. Her eyes were huge. "What are you doing here?" I took her check out of my pocket and held it in front of me. "I left it at home." "I thought you wanted to use the discount again." She looked at me as if I had just hit her. "It's not what you think." "No, Laura. It is exactly what I think it is." I took the divorce papers out of my jacket and put them on the counter. "Do you want to sign here or at home?" She didn't answer. I turned around and walked out. As I walked to the car, the cold air finally made me realize that it was over. And it was good. When I got in the car, my phone vibrated. "Can we talk?" The message was from Laura. I just stared at the screen for a few seconds, then locked the phone and threw it on the passenger seat. On the way home, I stopped at a roadside cafe. I ordered a coffee and sat by the window. Max, our dog, was waiting for me at home, and I could already imagine him greeting me, wagging his tail happily, unaware of what was happening. From the window of the cafe, I could see the highway, cars with flashing lights, and people hurrying about their business. Laura wrote again. "You don't understand. It's not that simple." This time I replied. "It is. Just don't cheat." The phone went dead. I finished my coffee, left the cash on the table, and drove home. When I opened the door, Max ran up to me, wagging his tail and bringing me his favorite toy. "Well, friend, it seems you're the boss of this house now." He barked as if in agreement. I sat down on the couch, turned on the TV, and for the first time in a long time felt silence. The kind of silence that doesn't press, but brings relief. The next day, Laura didn't come home. Part of me expected that she would try to fix it somehow, call, come, start making excuses. But a day passed, then two. And silence. All this time Max was hanging around me, as if he felt that something had changed. I spent more time walking with him. A few days after that meeting at the hotel, Laura finally called. "Can we meet?" "What for?" "Just to talk." I agreed. We met in a coffee shop on the outskirts of the city. Laura looked tired, but still tried to maintain the same confidence I had known for years. She sat down across from me and looked at me as if she had something important to say. "Nick, I don't know where to start." I shrugged my shoulders. "You don't have to start. I already know everything. It's not an excuse, but you're going to tell me anyway." She fell silent, looking down at her coffee cup. "I've ruined everything, haven't I?" "I guess I did." Max was lying at my feet under the table. His presence was somehow calming. "We could fix this somehow," she said quietly. I looked at her for a long time, trying to understand if she really believed in these words. "Laura, is that what you want?" She met my gaze, but there was no answer. And I realized everything I needed to know. I got up, leaving the money on the table. "You always knew where to find me. But it seems I'm not there anymore." She didn't say anything. Max followed me without looking back. After that meeting, I returned home and noticed how much my perception of space had changed. The apartment was the same, but it seemed wider, as if the invisible wall that had long stood between Laura and me had disappeared. Max laid down on the couch and sighed contentedly, as if we had both finally found some relief. The next morning I woke up later than usual. For the first time in many years, I didn't feel the tension that usually accompanied me when Laura wasn't around. I made coffee, went out to the balcony and watched the city wake up. Max was sitting next to me, carefully watching the pigeons on the neighboring roof. The phone was silent. Laura didn't call anymore. After lunch, I decided to go to Tom's workshop, an old friend who had opened a small carpentry business a few years ago. We hadn't seen each other for a long time, and I thought that a little physical work would do me good right now. When I walked into the workshop, Tom looked up from his wooden workpiece and smiled. "Well, look what the cat dragged in. I thought you had moved to another city." "No, I just decided to change things up a bit." Tom wiped his hands and nodded to an empty chair. "Sit down. Did something happen?" I wondered if I should tell him everything. "In short, Laura and I are breaking up." Tom raised his eyebrows. "Wow. I definitely didn't expect that." "Neither did I shrugged, but it happened. You know," Tom said, "going back to work, sometimes it's better that way. Not all marriages are meant to last forever." I nodded, watching him work. "Do you need any help?" "Always." I rolled up my sleeves and picked up a tool. The work quickly absorbed me, and the hours passed unnoticed. When I got home, the feeling of emptiness was gone. Max lay down at my feet, and I sat on the couch, looking out the window. Life went on. And I finally liked it. The next few weeks flew by in Tom's workshop. Working with wood turned out to be a kind of therapy. I spent hours sanding boards, assembling furniture, and felt my thoughts gradually organizing. Max was always lying by the door, watching us, and Tom joked that he was a better guard than any alarm system. One evening, when Tom and I were finishing up another order, Laurie came into the workshop. "Oh, Nick. I didn't expect to see you here." "I'm here a lot now," I smiled, wiping my hands of dust. Laurie came closer and looked at the table we were finishing. "Is this for the cafe downtown?" "Yes," Tom answered. "They ordered some new tables for the summer terrace." Laurie looked over at me. "I've heard about you and Laura." "It's hard not to in a town like this," I replied, sitting down on the edge of the table. She smiled slightly. "To be honest, you look better than I expected. The work helps." "And Max," Tom added, nodding at the dog. Laurie leaned over to pet Max, who raised his head and wagged his tail in satisfaction. "I'm here with news," she said, straightening up. "Sarah wants to organize a small festival at the lake next month. We need some help." "What kind of help?" "Benches, a stage. Maybe something else." "You've got hands of gold, Nick." Tom laughed. "He's on my payroll now, so be careful." "Okay, I'll help," I said. Laurie thanked me and left, leaving us to finish the job. In the days that followed, I was completely immersed in preparations for the festival. Tom and I built benches, set up stages, and Max enjoyed running around the lake. One day, when I was working on the shore, Emma, the owner of a small bakery that worked next to the workshop, came up to me. "Nick, do you build scenes now?" "It turns out that I do." She sat down on one of the benches and looked at the lake. "It's beautiful here. This is the right place for a new beginning." I sat down next to her, wiping my hands on my jeans. "Maybe this is my new beginning." Emma nodded and looked at Max, who lay down at our feet. "I think you're on the right track." We sat in silence, listening to the wind sway the trees. And for the first time in a long time, I felt that everything was finally falling into place. The festival was approaching, and each day was getting busier and busier. Tom and I spent the mornings on the lakefront setting up the benches and stage. Laurie was in charge of the decor, and Emma took over the organization of the food court with local bakeries and cafes. Max, as always, ran between us as if he were managing a construction site. One day, when we were finishing up the stage setup, Emma came up to me. "We have a problem." I put down the drill and turned to her. "What happened?" "One of the suppliers refused to deliver the furniture for the food area. They had some problems with the transportation." "Is it a big delay?" "We need the benches and tables in 3 days." I looked at Thomas, who was standing next to us listening. "We'll do it ourselves," he said, as if it were the easiest thing in the world. Emma looked at us with a little doubt. "Are you sure? It's a lot of work. If we work late, we'll make it." She sighed and smiled. "Good, I knew I could count on you." We worked almost without interruption. The lights were on in Tom's workshop at night, and Max slept right under the tables while we sawed boards and assembled furniture. Emma would bring us pies and coffee from time to time, joking that we had turned the workshop into our fortress. A few days later, everything was ready. The morning before the festival, I was standing by the lake, watching us finish setting up the benches, when Emma came up to me. "It turned out even better than I imagined," she said, running her hand along the back of the bench. "Yeah, not bad for the work of 2 amateurs." Emma sat down next to me and looked out at the lake. "It will be a little strange after the festival when it's all over, won't it?" I nodded. "But it's a good reminder that you can start over." She looked at me, meeting my gaze. "Maybe you're right." Max came over to us, sat down next to us, and put his head on Emma's lap. She laughed. "I think he's already decided he's going to stay with me after the festival." "I don't think so. He just feels where it's warm." We sat in silence until the sun began to sink below the horizon. This festival was important, but I realized that what was more important was how my life had changed in these few months. The festival went better than anyone expected. People gathered on the lake shore before lunch. They sat at the benches that Tom and I had made at night, listening to music and enjoying the evening sunset. Max ran around among the children who shared their snacks with him, and Ruby lay in the shadow of the stage, watching everything as if she were keeping order. Emma was in the center of the action, managing the food area, chatting with the guests, and looking like she had been waiting for this for a long time. When it was over, we sat on the beach by the fire. Laurie, Tom, Emma, Sarah, everyone who had a hand in the organization. "It was great," Tom said as he roasted marshmallows over the fire. "The city has needed something like this for a long time." "Yeah," Laurie added, "and we couldn't have done it without you and Nick." Emma looked at me and smiled softly. "Well, Nick is good with wood and screws." "And coffee," Tom put in. "Have you tried his specialty coffee in the workshop?" "I think that's Nick's next business," Laurie joked. I just laughed, throwing a branch into the fire. The next morning I woke up early. Max was lying quietly by the door, and the sun was shining outside. When I went out on the terrace, Emma was already sitting there with a cup of tea. It was good that we had time to clean everything yesterday. I sat down next to her, and Max immediately settled down at my feet. Yes, it was time to rest. Emma was quiet for a while, looking at the lake. Laurie said we could make the festival an annual event. "I think that's a good idea." She turned her gaze to me. "Nick, what's next?" I thought for a few seconds and then looked at her. "I don't know. But I think everything is fine here as it is." Emma squeezed my hand and nodded. "Me too." We sat in silence, listening to Max sniffle softly next to us. Life in the town went on as usual, but I felt that something inside me had changed. A few weeks after the festival, I met Laura by chance in a supermarket. I was just picking up a coffee when I heard a familiar voice behind me. "Nick?" I turned around and saw her. Laura was standing there with a basket containing only fruit and a bottle of wine. She looked different. Tired, but with the same smile I had once known so well. "Hi," I said, putting the coffee packet in the basket. Max was waiting for me at the entrance, sitting patiently by the cart. "How are you?" Laura asked, a little unsure. "Not bad." There was a pause between us. "I heard about the festival," she said. "They said you and Emma organized it." I nodded. "Yes, it was a team effort." Laura held my gaze for a second. "You and her, together?" I shrugged. "I don't know. But I'm happy where I am." She nodded and looked down, as if she'd expected that answer. "I'm glad you found something for yourself." I was about to reply, but at that moment Max ran up to me carrying his favorite stick. Laura leaned down and stroked him behind the ear, and he wagged his tail as if we hadn't seen each other for just a few days. He hadn't changed. "Unlike us," I said quietly. Laura stood up and nodded. "I guess so." She stood there for a moment, then smiled and turned back to the cash register. I watched her until she disappeared behind the door. Max looked at me as if he sensed something. "It's okay, buddy. Some stories have to end." I took the cart and headed for the exit. The next evening, I sat on the terrace with a cup of coffee, watching the sun slowly disappear behind the tree line. Max lay at my feet, snoring softly in the dusk. Emma appeared unnoticed, sat down next to me and handed me a piece of pie. "What's wrong?" she asked, noticing that I was staring at the lake in silence. "I saw Laura yesterday," I answered after a short pause. Emma raised her eyebrows a little in surprise. "And how was it?" "Oh, nothing. We just talked for a few minutes." She nodded, hugging her knees with her hands. "Did you feel better after this meeting?" I thought about it. "I think so. It was strange, but calm. No anger, no regrets. Just the realization that it was over." Emma was silent for a while and then said quietly, "I think it's good." I looked at her and smiled. "Yes, I think so too." Max lifted his head as if he felt something and curled up again. "Laura was an important part of your life." "That's okay. Important, but in the past." Emma squeezed my hand and looked at the lake. "Sometimes the past has to stay where it belongs." I ran my thumb over her palm, feeling the warmth. "And sometimes it reminds us of how much we have changed." We sat in silence until the last rays of the sun disappeared over the horizon. Life went on its way, and I felt like I was moving with it. It was a new stage, without the weight of the past. And for the first time in a long time, I was really looking forward to what was going to happen next. A few days after that conversation, life returned to its usual rhythm. Emma spent more time in her bakery, and I helped Tom with new orders in the workshop. Max, as always, was a constant companion in all our affairs. One evening, when I was about to close the workshop, Tom came up to me with a serious expression on his face. "Emma came by today," he said, smiling slightly. "She asked if you could help her with a delivery tomorrow." "Sure," I replied, putting away my tools. "What did she order?" "Never mind," Tom laughed, "just be there at 10. The next morning I arrived at the bakery at 10 sharp. Max, as usual, was sticking his head out of the window and looking around the street. When I walked in, Emma was behind the counter, putting pastries into boxes. "Oh, you're just in time," she said when she saw me. "They say you have something big to deliver." She nodded at several large boxes. "It's for an event. I think you can handle it." I took the boxes, and Max, smelling the fresh baked goods, immediately stood at the door like a guard. "Where should I take them?" "To the lake. Laurie is organizing a small picnic for the locals." When we arrived, Laurie was already standing by the tables, decorating them with flowers. "Finally," she said when I put the boxes on the table. Max immediately ran to the children who were already playing on the beach. Emma came closer and stopped next to him. Do you think we'll do the festival again this summer? Why not? It's our tradition now. She smiled and, after a moment's thought, added quietly. You are becoming more and more a part of this place. I looked at the lake reflecting the sun and felt that she was right. Perhaps this place had become a part of me. Emma took my hand, and we stayed standing by the water, listening to the children laughing and the wind rustling in the trees. Max came back, wet and happy, and lay down at our feet. Summer came quickly. After the picnic, life in the town seemed to slow down, but at the same time it was filled with small pleasant things. Every morning I would stop by Emma's for coffee, then work in the workshop with Tom. Max became an integral part of these trips. He would be the first to enter the bakery, knowing that Emma always had something delicious prepared for him. One evening, as Emma and I were sitting on the terrace, she pulled out a small notebook from her bag. I asked her what it was. She smiled as she opened it. Plans. For what? Emma flipped through the pages until she found the right one. Laurie suggested a summer festival by the lake. But this time it was bigger. I raised an eyebrow. Wasn't that enough for us last time? She laughed. Not that big, we'll just add a few new areas. And Tom said he's willing to build more furniture if you help. Tom didn't ask me, of course. That's why I'm telling you now. I smiled and took the notebook from her. Well, show me what you've got in mind. We spent the next few weeks preparing. This time we decided to put a small wooden pavilion right by the water where guests could sit and watch the sunset. Tom built the frame, and Emma and I did the painting and decorating. Max was always with us, running along the shore or sleeping in the shade of the trees while we worked. One day, when we were finishing placing the benches, Emma stopped and looked at me. Did you ever think you'd stay here for long? I wiped my hands on my jeans and looked at the lake. No. But now I can't imagine where else I could be. Emma nodded, as if she understood this better than I did. I think we're similar, you and I. We were both looking for something and found peace. I took her hand, and we stood there for a few minutes, listening to the wind play in the branches of the trees. Peace is not so bad, I said quietly. Sometimes it's the best thing that can happen. Max raised his head and barked as if to agree with us. It seemed to me that this summer would be remembered forever. The festival was approaching, and our lives revolved around preparations. Emma stayed by the lake more often than not, setting up lanterns and planning how to decorate the pavilion. Tom worked on the stage, and I helped with the small details: painting, tables, benches. Max was always around, running between the boards, bringing me branches, as if he wanted to be a part of this work too. One evening, when Emma and I were staying by the lake until sunset, Laurie came up to us. Do you know you've become a local legend? I looked up from the paint I was applying to one of the benches. A legend? Emma laughed. Laurie likes to exaggerate. But I'm serious, Laurie replied, crossing her arms over her chest. The whole town knows what you two are doing with the festival. People even say it's the best thing that's happened to our community in years. I shrugged. I'm just painting benches, Laurie. You think it's that easy? It's more than it looks. Emma put her hand on my shoulder. We just wanted to create a place where people would feel good. And you did, Laurie smiled. Now, if you don't mind, I'm going to help with this bench. She took a brush and sat down next to me, painting the other half. The festival was opening at sunset. The lake was sparkling with gold, the lanterns reflected in the water, creating a fairy tale atmosphere. People gathered near the stage, children ran on the grass, and Max proudly sat near the pavilion, as if he understood that this was his territory. Emma stood next to me, leaning against my shoulder. Look at this, she whispered. I looked around. People were laughing, talking, enjoying the evening. The place had come alive. It turned out well, I said. Emma nodded. We did. Max barked and ran to the kids who were waving at him from the other side of the field. I looked at Emma. Do you think we'll do this every year? I think we will. And every year it will be even better. She took my hand and we walked to the stage where the music was already playing. This evening was a part of our history. And I knew it was just the beginning. The festival lasted until late at night. Music, laughter, and the clinking of glasses echoed over the lake, and lanterns swayed in the light breeze, creating a golden halo around the water. Max lay down near the stage, his face barely moving in his sleep. Ruby appeared later in the night, as usual, unnoticed, and walked around the area as if to check if everything was okay. I sat on a bench outside the pavilion, watching Emma talk to Lori and a few locals. She was laughing, holding a glass of wine, and seemed to be a part of it all, as if she had always been here. When she turned to me, her cheeks were a little pink from the wine and the evening chill. "How are you?" she asked, sitting down next to me. "Tired, but it's a pleasant tiredness." Emma looked at the stage, where Tom was already taking down the set, preparing everything for completion. "I don't think I've seen you this calm in a long time." I smiled as I watched Max stretch when he heard our voices. "I think it's because I'm where I want to be now." Emma quietly took my hand and squeezed my fingers. "And that's good." We sat like that for a while longer, while people slowly dispersed, leaving behind only footprints in the grass and warm memories. The next morning I woke up to Max spinning around the door, pawing at the wooden floor. Emma was already in the kitchen, the smell of fresh coffee wafting into the bedroom. "You're early," I said, walking into the kitchen and sitting down at the table. She put a cup in front of me. I couldn't sleep. I wanted to do something nice after last night. I took a sip of coffee and looked at her. "Do you think Laura would have come to the festival if we were still together?" Emma thought about it, then sat down across from me. "I don't know. I think sometimes people stay where they are comfortable. And sometimes they need to leave to find something new." "Are you talking about me?" "Maybe," she smiled. Max looked up when he heard someone knocking on the door. I got up and opened it. It was Tom. "Back to work again?" I joked. "As usual. Benches don't fix themselves." Emma winked at me and handed me a pie for Tom. "Don't forget to share." I took the pie and Tom and I walked to the workshop while Max ran alongside, excited about the new day. For the next few days, Tom and I worked in the workshop, fixing the benches and the pavilion after the festival. Max, as usual, lazily laid by the door, and Ruby appeared sometime in the evening, as if just to check if everything was okay. One day, when we were finishing up our work, Tom, without taking his eyes off the board, suddenly said, "Laura came to see me yesterday." I froze for a second, but quickly pulled myself together. "What did she want?" "She asked about you." I put the hammer on the table and turned to him. "And what did you tell her?" Tom smiled. "That you were holding up well. And that it seems like you're finally okay." That was true. He looked up and nodded. She looked like she wanted to say something, but in the end she didn't say anything. I thought about it, but then shrugged. I guess she has nothing to say anymore. Tom went back to work. Maybe he did. But sometimes it's hard for people to let go. That evening when I got home, Emma was sitting on the terrace with a book. "What's wrong?" she asked, noticing that I had been standing by the door for a long time, as if thinking about something. "Laura went to see Tom." Emma looked at me carefully but said nothing. I sat down next to her, pulling the blanket she was wearing over her. Max immediately raised his head and put it on my lap. "How do you feel about this?" I ran my hand through Max's fur and said quietly, "Calm down. Last time, I probably would have felt something different. But now, I'm grateful that life turned out this way." Emma leaned closer and put her head on my shoulder. "I guess we always meet the right people at the right time." I put my arms around her and nodded. Sometimes that's how it works. The lake shimmered in the moonlight, and a light breeze swayed the lanterns we hadn't taken off after the festival. Autumn was gradually coming into its own. The leaves were flying off the trees, and the mornings became cooler. The lake quieted down, as if it was also preparing for changes. Emma's coffee shop was running like clockwork, regular customers, warm pies, and the smell of cinnamon in the air. Max spent most of his time there, lying lazily at the entrance or on the terrace, receiving guests as if he were the owner of the place. One evening, when I was returning from the studio, I noticed Laura on the other side of the street. She was walking with her head down and didn't even see me. I stopped for a second but didn't follow her. The past remained where it belonged. On the weekend, Emma and I decided to go to the forest for a long walk. Max, hearing the word forest, immediately jumped up and started running in circles around us, worried that we might forget to take him with us. The morning was fresh and quiet. The forest was bathed in golden light, and dry leaves crunched underfoot. "Have you noticed how fast this summer has gone by?" Emma said, holding my hand. I did. But it was a good summer. She smiled slightly. "And you've changed." I looked at her. "Different? Calmer. You no longer carry around what you used to." I thought about it, listening to the birds flying in the branches somewhere. Maybe it's because I let myself move on. Emma stopped and looked me in the eye. "I'm glad I became a part of this further." I leaned over, lightly touching her forehead with mine. "And I'm glad you're in this now. Max barked impatiently and rushed forward, disappearing among the trees. "Looks like someone's ready for a new adventure," Emma laughed, pulling me along. And so were we. We walked on, listening to the silence of the forest, which seemed so familiar and new at the same time. Life was simple, but it was in this simplicity that I found happiness. Autumn was in full swing. Every walk in the woods became a ritual. Emma, Max, and I would spend hours wandering among the trees, enjoying the silence and cool air. One day, on our way home from such a walk, Emma suddenly stopped at an old wooden house at the edge of the forest. "Look," she pointed to the cobweb-covered windows, "someone used to live here." The house looked abandoned, but something about it touched me. "You know," Emma said, turning to me, "I think this place has a story." "Every place has a story." She was silent for a while, looking at the house. "Would you like us to have a small house like this somewhere among the trees?" I looked at her and smiled. "If there's a fireplace and a big yard for Max, why not?" Emma laughed. "I'm serious." I was too. Max was exploring the overgrown yard, sniffing every corner. "Let's look inside," she suggested. "If they don't take us for vandals." We went up to the porch. The door was closed, but the window on the side was slightly ajar. Emma looked inside. It was empty. But spacious. I came closer, and we both stood looking through the glass at the old room with the fireplace. "I can imagine how cozy it used to be here," she said quietly. "Maybe one day we'll find something like this for ourselves." Emma took my hand and leaned closer. "I think that's a good idea." Max ran up to us, and we went back down to the trail. I looked back at the house, feeling that this random stop would somehow affect us. A few weeks later, I stopped by Tom's workshop and he said, as if by the way, "You know that house at the edge of the woods? Have you heard about that house at the edge of the forest? It's for sale." I looked up from my tools. "Really?" "Yeah. The city wants to write it off because it has been empty for several years." I thought about it, feeling the news leave a resonance in me. That evening I told Emma about it. She looked up at me as if she had been waiting for me to say it. "Let's go there again." "Do you think we should?" "Why not?" Max overheard us talking and immediately jumped in the door, as if he had been the first to think it was a good idea. We packed up and went there in the evening, when the sun was already hiding behind the treetops. The house was still there, just as quiet and a little mysterious. But now I was looking at it from a different perspective. And it seemed that this abandoned house had a chance to get a second life, with us. The next morning we returned to the house at the edge of the forest. The sun was just beginning to break through the fog when we got out of the car. Max was the first to jump out and run to the porch, wagging his tail like it was his territory. Emma stopped at the gate and looked at me. "Do you think he was waiting for us?" "The house?" I smiled. "Emma, well, yeah. Look, it's been standing here for so many years. Maybe it was waiting for us." I petted Max, who was already exploring the bushes near the fence. "It looks like Max definitely wants to stay here." Emma bent down and sat on the porch steps. "Imagine what it will look like here in the fall. Leaves everywhere, morning walks in the woods." I sat down next to her, and we looked at the old walls covered with time together. "If we take this house, we'll have a lot of work to do." Emma smiled. "But we have Tom. And you thought he would agree to help?" "Of course," she winked, "he won't say no." Max suddenly raised his head and ran into the woods, sniffing around. "I think someone's already giving us a sign," Emma said, pointing to Max. I got up and followed the dog. The forest was quiet, only the wind whispered among the trees. We followed Max, who kept stopping and looking back, as if he was calling us on. A few minutes later we found ourselves in a small clearing overlooking a lake. The water glistened in the morning light, and the trees reflected on the surface. "Nick," Emma whispered, "this place is perfect." I nodded, feeling a warmth spread through me. "I think we've found our new home." Max ran over to us, bringing a branch, and laid it at our feet as if to confirm our words. Emma leaned over and stroked him behind the ear. "Well, Max, it looks like you live in the forest now." I put my arms around her shoulders and we stood there, looking out at the lake. This house, this forest, everything seemed right. Life was moving forward, and I knew we were on the right track. A week later, we closed on the house. Tom, as Emma had promised, immediately agreed to help with the renovations. We assembled a team of several locals, all of whom wanted to contribute to the restoration of the old hut. Max, of course, was the construction manager, carefully watching every nail and board. The work went quickly. We removed the old roof, renovated the porch and replaced the floors in the rooms. Everything was going well until one evening, when we were finishing up, a storm broke out. Thunder tore through the sky, and the rain fell like a wall on the forest. "It's time to go," Tom shouted as he hammered the last nail into the window frame. Emma was already gathering the tools inside, and I tried to cover the unfinished part of the roof with a tarpaulin. The wind took it out of my hands and tore it right into the forest. Max barked and ran after it. "Max!" Emma shouted, running after him into the rain. I immediately ran after him. The wind was strong and the branches were whipping my face, but I could see Max dashing between the trees while the tarp was stuck somewhere in the bushes. "Max, get back!" I shouted again, but he was already at the edge of the lake. Suddenly, a strong gust of wind broke an old tree, and it fell with a crash right onto the path between Max and me. I stopped, staring at the span of the branches and the obstructed path. Max was whimpering on the other side, but he couldn't get back. Emma ran up to me with a flashlight in her hand. "Is he there?" "Yes," I pointed through the branches, "but the path is blocked." She looked at me and silently began to walk around the tree on the other side. "Nick! I found a way through, let's go." We walked around the fallen tree and I saw Max standing by the lake, holding the tarp in his teeth as if it were the greatest treasure. I breathed a sigh of relief, ran up to him and stroked his wet fur. "You are a hero, my friend." Emma leaned into him and Max licked her face. "He saved the tarp," she laughed. We were standing in the rain, and the forest was rumbling around us. I think he deserves a new collar, I said, looking at Max. We walked back to the house, and despite the storm, I felt that this place was getting closer to us. That night we sat by the fireplace, listening to the rain drumming on the roof. Max was lying next to me, and Emma was wrapped in a blanket, leaning against me. "This house will weather many more storms," she said quietly. "So will we," I replied, looking at the fire. After that storm, the house at the edge of the forest seemed to become a part of us. Every day, Emma, Tom, and I continued to repair it, regardless of the weather. Max was always there, watching every step carefully and making sure that no board was left untouched. One morning I woke up before everyone else. The rain had stopped, and the forest looked fresh, as if it had washed away the fatigue of the night. Max was lying by the door, and Emma was still asleep, wrapped in a blanket on the old couch we had brought in a few days ago. I quietly walked out into the yard. The air was cold and filled with the smell of pine trees and wet earth. Water was dripping from the edges of the roof, and that was the only sound, except for the slight rustling of the leaves. On the porch were several boards that we were preparing for the new wall. I took one of them and started working. As I was hammering in the first nail, I heard the door creak slightly. "Can't you sleep?" Emma stood on the threshold, holding a cup of hot coffee. Max raised his head, stretched, and lazily walked out into the yard. "I just decided to take advantage of the silence while everyone was sleeping," I said, smiling. She sat down on the stairs and wrapped herself even tighter in the blanket. "It's especially quiet here after the rain." I nodded and went back to work. "Are we really going to stay here, Nick?" she asked after a moment of silence. I stopped and looked at her. "Do you want it any other way?" Emma thought for a moment, looking around the yard. "No. I'm just not used to this kind of silence yet. The city has always been noisy. That's why we're here." She smiled as she took a sip of coffee. "I think Max definitely doesn't mind." At that moment he lay down at her feet and curled up. "Yes, he seems to be completely settled." In the afternoon, Tom joined us. He brought new materials for the roof and some old doors he promised to find. "I found them in Laurie's barn," he said, pulling the doors out of the back of his pickup truck. "She said they were here in the last century." Emma looked at it curiously. "They'll fit perfectly in the house." I helped Tom carry the door inside. "We're really building this house out of the wreckage of the past," I said, wiping my hands of dust. Tom laughed. "But it will be a story to tell over a cup of tea." A few days later, we finally finished the bulk of the work. The house came to life. The windows shone with a warm light, and the smell of fresh wood that we always associate with a new beginning reigned inside. Emma decorated the kitchen, hanging old photos and vintage shelves we found at the local market. Tom helped in the yard, making benches for the terrace out of pallets. Max, as usual, was lying under the shade of a tree, watching with indifferent interest. As we sat together on the porch drinking hot tea, I realized that I never wanted to go back to the city. This house was the place I was looking for. "What now?" Emma asked, leaning on my shoulder. I looked at the lake, which reflected the sunset. "Now we just live." She nodded and closed her eyes, enjoying the moment. Max was sleeping at our feet, and the whole world seemed right. Autumn began to gradually lose ground, and the morning frost reminded us that winter was close. The house stood there as if it had always been part of this forest. The smoke from the chimney slowly rose into the cold air, and Max, despite the cold, continued to run around the yard, burying the branches he found in the ground. Emma started talking more and more about the garden, about new flowers in the spring, and even showed me sketches of flower beds and benches in her notebook. "In winter, this place will look completely different," she said one evening as we sat by the fireplace. I threw some wood on, and the flames flared up again, casting a glare on the wooden walls. "Do you think it will change?" Emma smiled as she watched Max sleep with his head in her lap. Everything changes. But I think it will be a good change. I thought, listening to the crackling of the fire. The important thing is that we are ready. The next morning I woke up to a light knock on the door. I opened the door and saw Tom standing there with a thermos in his hand and a windy red cheek. "I knew you were awake," he smiled as he crossed the threshold. "Tom, it's 7 in the morning. The perfect time to see the first snow." I looked out into the yard and everything was covered with a light layer of fluffy white snow. Max was already running around in it, leaving footprints. It seemed Max had already noticed. Tom put the thermos on the table and took off his mittens. "Lori said she wanted to organize a fair for the winter holidays. She asked if you and I would help." I nodded, filling cups with hot coffee from the thermos. "Of course. I'm even curious to see what the festival will look like in winter." Tom sat down by the fireplace, rubbing his hands together. "And yet, Nick, I never thought you'd leave town." I looked out the window to see Emma standing on the porch, wrapped in a warm scarf. "I think I just found what I was looking for." Tom smiled, nodding. "I can see that." Over the next few weeks, Tom, Lori, and I helped organize the winter fair at the lake. We built small wooden houses for the craftsmen who planned to sell their wares. Emma took over the baking. Every day the kitchen smelled like cinnamon, ginger, and fresh pies. Max, as always, accompanied us everywhere, diligently checking every corner of the construction site. When the fair opened, the forest looked completely different. The trees were decorated with lanterns, and the small houses glowed with the warm light of candles and lamps. People had gathered from all over the town, children were skating on the lake, adults were drinking hot mulled wine, and music was playing over the forest. Emma stood next to me, holding a cup of hot chocolate. "Look at this," she said quietly. I looked at the lanterns, at the happy faces of the people and realized that this place had become a part of us. I think we are not just residents of this town anymore. Emma looked at me with a smile. We are part of this story. Max ran up to us with the children throwing snowballs at him and lay down at our feet. I put my arms around Emma's shoulders and we stood there as the festival continued, listening to the laughter and the sound of the snow crunching. This house, this place, it was ours. And I knew it was going to get even better. The fair ended late in the evening. The light of lanterns was still flickering on the trees when the last guests left. Only a few children were running around the stage while their parents put their purchases away. Max was lying tiredly on a bench, looking at the fire in the fireplace we had lit in the center of the square. Emma sat down next to me, resting her head on my shoulder. "Have you noticed how fast this year has gone by?" she asked quietly. I nodded, hugging her more warmly. "Yes. But it feels like we've been here forever." She raised her head and looked at me with a slight smile. "And it feels good?" "Very much so." Max raised his head when he heard our voices and moved closer to the fire. "Do you remember the day we first found this house?" Emma asked, looking at the dark silhouettes of the trees. "How could I forget?" Max sniffed out the place first. I think he knew it from the beginning. I looked at the dog and ran my hand through his fur. He had definitely led us to the right place. As we closed the houses in the square, snow began to fall slowly from the sky. Lori waved to us from across the square. "Have a good night. And thank you for everything." Tom, who was standing next to her, raised his hand. "Don't forget that we'll be here again in the spring." Emma smiled and waved back. "Spring is still a long way off." "It will fly by quickly," I said. We walked slowly through the forest back to the house. Max ran ahead of us, leaving footprints in the snow, and silence reigned around us, broken only by our footsteps. When we got inside, I threw some wood into the fireplace. Emma sat down by the fire, wrapped in a blanket, and watched the flames play on the walls. "You know," she said when I sat down next to her, "I thought it would be harder to find peace." I put my arms around her and held her close. Sometimes everything is easier than it seems. Max curled up by the fireplace, sighing contentedly. We sat there, listening to the snow falling outside the window. Life was simple, but real. I knew there was still much to come, but at that moment I